Eric Clapton leaned against the wall. He didn't look at his guitar. He looked at the floor. And he never went back on stage that night. London. December 1966. The Regent Street Polytechnic. A small venue, perhaps 200 people, the kind of place where the stage was barely raised and the backstage was just a corridor with brick walls and a single hanging lightbulb. Eric Clapton was God. They'd written it on the walls. Clapton is God. In subway tunnels, on building facades, scrawled in bathroom stalls across London. He was 21 years old and the acknowledged master of the electric guitar in Britain. Maybe the world. He'd earned it. 3 years of relentless practice. John Mayall's Blues Breakers. The Yardbirds before that. Now Cream, his new power trio that was redefining what rock music could be. Clapton could make a guitar sing, scream, weep. He'd studied the American blues masters, B.B. King, Muddy Waters, Robert Johnson, and brought their language to a generation of British kids who never heard anything like it. When Clapton walked into a room with a guitar, other musicians fell silent. Not from fear. From respect. From the understanding that you were in the presence of someone who had touched something true. That night at Regent Street Polytechnic, Clapton had played the first set with Cream. It had been good. More than good. The crowd had roared. Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker had been locked in tight. Clapton's solos had been fluid, powerful, technically immaculate. During the break, Clapton stood backstage in the narrow corridor, his Gibson Les Paul slung over his shoulder, smoking a cigarette, talking quietly with Ginger about the second set. The usual post-performance wind down. The familiar satisfaction of a job done well. Someone mentioned that another guitarist was in the audience. An American. New to London. Name was Jimi something. Hendrix. Someone clarified. Just got here from the States. Been sitting in at clubs. Clapton nodded vaguely. London was full of musicians. Americans came through all the time, looking to make it in the British scene. He's asking if he can sit in for a song, the venue manager said, appearing in the corridor. Says he just wants to play one. Clapton shrugged. Sure. Why not? He'd done it dozens of times. Let visiting musicians sit in for a tune. It was the culture. You shared the stage. You welcomed players into the circle. And besides, Clapton was secure. He was God. What threat could some unknown American possibly pose? The second set began. Cream played 3 songs. The crowd was with them. Everything was going exactly as it should. And then Jimi Hendrix walked onto the stage. He was tall, thin, wore a military jacket that looked like he'd slept in it. His hair was a wild halo. He moved slowly, almost languidly, as if he had all the time in the world. He carried a white Fender Stratocaster. No announcement. No introduction. He just plugged in. What do you want to play? Clapton asked him. Hendrix looked at him with eyes that were both gentle and absolutely certain. Howlin' Wolf, he said quietly. Killing Floor. Clapton knew the song. Everyone knew the song. A blues standard. Fast, aggressive, technically demanding. The kind of song that separated the competent from the masterful. All right, Clapton said, settling back into his position. Jack and Ginger locked in. They started the count. And Jimi Hendrix began to play. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. What came out of that Stratocaster was not music as Clapton understood it. It was something else entirely. Hendrix wasn't playing notes. He was bending reality. His fingers moved across the fretboard with impossible fluidity. Not fast, not show-off fast, but liquid. Like water finding its path. Every note sang with intention. Every bend had emotional weight that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and inarguable. But it wasn't just technique. Hendrix was playing with the amplifier itself. Feedback that should have been noise became melody. Distortion that should have been chaos became rhythm. He was using the entire sonic space, the hum of the tubes, the resonance of the room, the breathing of the audience. As instruments, Clapton felt his hands tighten on his own guitar neck. He'd heard great players before. He was a great player. But this was different. Hendrix wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't performing. He was simply existing at a level of communion with the instrument that Clapton had spent 3 years trying to reach and had thought he'd achieved. He had not achieved it. He had not even understood what it looked like to achieve it. The song continued. 90 seconds. 2 minutes. Hendrix's solo unfolded like a conversation between the guitar and forces Clapton couldn't name. The audience had gone completely silent, not the polite silence of respect, but the stunned silence of witnessing something they didn't have language for yet. Clapton stood on stage with his guitar and realized with perfect, terrible clarity that he was not playing anymore. His hands had stopped. He was just standing there, watching. Jack Bruce had noticed. Ginger Baker had noticed. They kept playing, locked into the rhythm, but their eyes kept darting to Clapton, asking the silent question, "Are you seeing this?" Hendrix played the final phrase. He didn't end with fireworks. He didn't showboat. He just brought the solo back down to earth with a gentle, falling line that felt like mercy. The last note rang out. Hendrix stepped back from the microphone. He didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge the applause that was starting to build. He just unplugged his guitar, nodded once to Clapton, not condescending, not victorious, just a simple acknowledgement between players, and walked off stage. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. The audience erupted. Not the usual concert applause. Something wilder. People were standing. Some were laughing in disbelief. Others were just staring at the empty spot where Hendrix had been standing, trying to process what they'd witnessed. Cream finished the set. Clapton played. His hands worked. Notes came out. But something fundamental had broken. When the show ended, Clapton walked off stage without speaking to anyone. He made his way to the backstage corridor, the same narrow brick hallway where he'd stood 40 minutes earlier, secure in his mastery, comfortable in his identity as God. He leaned against the wall. His guitar hung loose in his hand, suddenly heavy in a way it had never been before. He looked at the floor. Down the corridor, maybe 10 feet away, Jimi Hendrix sat on an equipment case, his Stratocaster resting across his lap. He was alone. Not celebrating. Not holding court. Just sitting quietly, rolling a cigarette, his face peaceful. Clapton wanted to say something. Wanted to ask the question that was screaming in his head. How did you do that? What was that? Where did that come from? But the words wouldn't form. Because Clapton understood, in that terrible, clarifying way that truth arrives. That there was no answer Hendrix could give that would bridge the gap. Some things couldn't be taught. Some levels couldn't be reached by practice alone. Hendrix looked up. Met Clapton's eyes. And in that look was something Clapton would spend years trying to name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't even triumph. It was just knowledge. Gentle, absolute knowledge of what his playing did to other guitarists. An awareness carried without malice. Hendrix nodded. Once. The same simple acknowledgement he'd given on stage. Then he looked back down at his cigarette. The conversation was over before it began. Clapton pushed off the wall and walked out. Out of the corridor, out of the venue, into the December London cold. He didn't say goodbye to Jack or Ginger. He didn't wait for the usual post-show decompression. He just walked. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. Clapton went home to his flat in Chelsea. He put his guitar in the corner. He sat on his bed. And he stared at his hands. These hands had been celebrated. Written about. Worshipped, literally, on London walls. Clapton is God. But tonight those hands had been revealed as merely very good. Maybe even great. But not transcendent. Not inevitable. Not touched by whatever force had been moving through Hendrix's fingers. Clapton didn't sleep that night. He kept seeing it. The way Hendrix had bent that note. The way he'd let feedback become melody. The casual, almost lazy grace of it all. The realization that Hendrix hadn't been trying. That was the part that destroyed everything. Hendrix had walked on stage, played one song, and dismantled the entire architecture of what Clapton thought mastery looked like. And he'd done it without effort. Without aggression. Without even seeming to notice the carnage he was leaving behind. The next morning, Clapton saw the graffiti on his way to rehearsal. Clapton is God. Someone had spray-painted it on a wall near the tube station. He stopped, stared at it, and felt nothing but the hollow awareness that the title no longer fit. He'd been knocked off a throne he hadn't realized was so fragile. Over the following weeks, the story spread. Musicians who'd been at Regent Street Polytechnic that night told other musicians. The word went out, there's an American. Name is Hendrix. You need to see him. He's different. Pete Townsend saw him. Came back shaken, talking about sounds he'd never heard before. Jeff Beck saw him. Stopped talking about his own playing for a month. Jimmy Page saw him. Started completely rethinking his approach to the guitar. The British guitar gods, all of them, had the same experience. They went to see Jimi Hendrix. They watched him play. And they came back changed. Not destroyed. Changed. Because Hendrix didn't break them out of malice. He broke them out of existence. Clapton kept playing. Cream continued. His career didn't end. He would go on to decades of success, iconic songs, legendary status. But something had shifted that night in December 1966. The easy confidence was gone. The assumption that he'd reached the summit was gone. The title of God, even though others still used it, felt like a costume he could no longer wear honestly. Years later, in interviews, Clapton would talk about that night. He'd be diplomatic. Complimentary. Jimmy was incredible, he'd say. Completely changed the game. But people who knew him well, who'd been around in those days, they knew the real story. Jimi Hendrix had played one song. And Eric Clapton had walked off stage, leaned against a wall, and never felt the same way about his instrument again. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. December 1966 became a dividing line. Before Hendrix and after Hendrix. The guitar players who'd been at Regent Street Polytechnic that night carried it differently. There was a humility in their playing afterward that hadn't been there before. A knowledge that mastery was not a destination but a horizon that kept receding. Hendrix, for his part, continued playing small clubs around London for a few more months. Word spread. Managers took notice. Within a year, he'd have a record deal, a band, global fame. But those who saw him in those early London days, in small rooms, narrow stages, backstage corridors with brick walls, they knew they'd witnessed something that couldn't be replicated. Not just extraordinary playing, but the moment when extraordinary playing revealed itself as something beyond technique, beyond practice, beyond the accumulated knowledge of 3 years or 30 years. A force that simply was. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Eric Clapton never stopped playing guitar. He became, by any measure, one of the most successful and influential musicians of the 20th century. But he never called himself God again. And when people asked him, decades later, who the greatest guitarist was, he'd give the same answer every time. Jimmy. Just that. Just the name. Because some truths don't need elaboration. That night at Regent Street Polytechnic, Jimi Hendrix's Stratocaster leaned against the equipment case in that backstage corridor. After he left, someone noticed he'd left a pick on the amp. A simple piece of plastic. Thin. Worn. One of the stagehands picked it up, thinking to return it. But by the time he turned around, Hendrix was already gone. Disappeared into the London night the same way he'd appeared, quietly, without ceremony. The stagehand kept the pick. Showed it to people sometimes. This is what he used, he'd say. That night he played one song and changed everything. People would hold it, turn it over in their fingers, looking for some answer in the worn edges. Looking for some secret. There was no secret. Just mastery so complete it needed no announcement. Eric Clapton kept his guitar. Kept playing. Became a legend in his own right. But he never forgot that night. Never forgot the weight of his Les Paul hanging useless in his hand while Hendrix played. Never forgot the feeling of understanding, with perfect clarity, that greatness has levels. And some levels aren't reached by wanting them. Years later, someone asked Clapton what he learned from Jimi Hendrix. He thought for a long time before answering. That God was the wrong word, he finally said. Jimi didn't play like God. He played like someone who never needed the title in the first place. The graffiti stayed on London walls for years. Clapton is God. Slowly fading. Slowly covered by new paint, new words, new legends. But musicians remembered that December night. And they understood what had really happened. Not a battle. Not a competition. Just a moment when the ceiling they'd been reaching for turned out to be a floor.